Well, thank you all for coming, taking your Veterans Day off and coming out to hear my presentation tonight on a cold, wet Monday night. I want to thank Megan and Margot Pope, our president, for inviting me to speak. And sort of the event that, as you all know, that sort of stimulated this is the centennial of the purchase of the oldest house, which I'll talk a little bit more about it, but really a fundamental event in the history of historic preservation in the city of St. Augustine. I wanted to thank the board of directors for having me become a member. It's a real honor for me, and it's a way of me giving back, I think, to a historical society that has given to so much to me professionally over the years. Particularly, I'd like to mention the library staff. Going back to Jackie Beardsley, Charles Tingley, Bob Naraki, Deborah Willis, and so many others that have helped me along the way in my professional career. So I got an email from Dr. Susan Parker. She says, "Tell them how important historic preservation is. We always get criticized for it and not doing enough." But it really has been an awfully important part of the activities of the St. Augustine Historical now for going on about 135 years. And I think we forget about the Society's role in historic preservation. I mentioned the library, the museum, but now for that time period, the St. Augustine Historical Society has made some major contributions into historic preservation. And it began really with the founding of the Historical Society, but the purchase of the oldest house and the subsequent restoration really laid the foundation for historic preservation here in St. Augustine. Let's think about it. The Society paid about $20,000 for it, which was a lot of money at the time. But what did they do? They gave us a historic resource, which is really priceless to us now. The St. Augustine, the Society, as I said, is kind of the theme of my presentation tonight. It was a pioneer preservation organization, and the Society, particularly after the acquisition of the oldest house, really set the standards for historic documentation, architectural preservation, and archaeology. Particularly in the 1950s with the restoration of the Gonzalez Alvarez oldest house. And the Society has also been, I think, since its founding, the historical conscience of the city, an organization that spoke up for history and particularly the preservation of historic sites. And despite what many think, and I'll talk a little bit about it, it remains an active participant in historic preservation activities. So, kind of giving a little bit of introduction to me, did you ever get a song in your head that you just couldn't get out? Well, mine was Wonderful World by Simon and Garfunkel. Particularly the lyrics, don't know much about history. And so, history was really part of my DNA. And I had the great fortune, this was something I wrote in the little introduction that Megan sent me. You know, how did you become involved in history? It was almost, I was born into it. And I was fortunate very early in life. The first 10 years of my life I spent with my great-grandparents. They were my caretakers. My great-grandmother was born in 1885. Never saw a car until she was 20 years old. Never saw a plane until she was well in adulthood. Always blamed Woodrow Wilson for getting us into World War I. And unfortunately, one of the stories she always told was she lost her sister in the Spanish flu endemic in 1918. So that was really a kind of a fundamental part of my growing up and my introduction to history and my passion for it. And then that's me in the fedora with my great-grandfather, who was a great storyteller, and jokester, as you can see. And much of my early youth was spent going to historic sites, particularly old cemeteries. And I was inspired, I guess, by my great-grandfather, who was a great joke teller. I can remember my first joke going to a family cemetery. And if you remember the context of the 1950s, Western movies and TV series, Bonanza, Rawhide. So I turned to my great-grandparents, I said, "This is Tombstone territory," which that was they're still laughing and rolling in the aisles over that one. So again, I was always the kind of the history geek from fourth grade on. We moved to Florida in 1960, and I really fell in love with St. Augustine. I came and celebrated my 8th birthday at the old jail, and coming to St. Augustine, going to the old fort, going to the oldest house, going to Marineland were important parts of my growing up. And it was always my dream to come live in St. Augustine and practice my profession here. So I wanted to begin to talk about the society's role in historic preservation, just with a little bit of background and context, and talk about some of the features and the historic sites that are character defining to the city, and then segue into talking about the society's role in the historic preservation. So of course we know St. Augustine was founded in 1565 by Pedro Menendez, and the early settlement developed in 4 stages. The first early settlement was the Fountain of Youth, Mission Nombre de Dios, which has been documented by archaeologists, particularly Kathy Deegan. Then the settlement moved to Anastasia Island for a brief period, 1565 to 1572-73. In 1586, Sir Francis Drake attacked St. Augustine. Of course, he destroyed the city, but left us with a map of the 3rd phase of settlement, which is very interesting and something people don't really talk too much about. And I had an opportunity to work with Dr. Garcia Santana, a Cuban historian, and she wrote a book about the 7 villas of Cuba, which were the 7 cities that were founded prior to the establishment of the laws of the Indies, which laid out Spanish towns. And we've got one of these here in St. Augustine. And then in 1598, really one of the 2 things I think that defined St. Augustine, the Spanish town plan was laid out. And much of that remains today. And we can see the original, the 1586 settlement that's shown on Boisio's map is still there. So this is, again, one of the major features that when people came here, particularly after the colonial period, really gave St. Augustine a sense of time and place. And the town plan is one of our relatively few national historic landmarks, meaning it's really of national and even international significance. In 1607, of course, the English found Jamestown. Dr. Gannon's joke was when Jamestown was founded, St. Augustine was up for urban renewal, but fortunately the Spanish Crown Department of Historic Resources were there to make sure that significant sites were not damaged or destroyed. 1672, one of the other really significant sites, the Castillo de San Marcos, was constructed. And of course, to understand St. Augustine, you have to know that it was a presidio, basically a military base. And the Castillo was the cornerstone of the town plan and that function. And the construction of the Castillo introduced the age of coquina construction. And for the first time, construction of private residences using coquina began. It's got a first Spanish period building, Gonzalez Alvarez house, with characteristic features, the rejas, the canales, the building set directly on the street, some of the character-defining features of the Spanish architecture. The northern limit of St. Augustine was established in 1738 with the construction of the Mosé defense line and the Mosé settlement to the north. And to the south was Fort Matanzas, again, another National Historic Landmark. The important materials were tabby houses, and we see here tabby wall, and above all, coquina. So don't let anybody fool you when they talk about cobblestones in St. Augustine. There were no cobblestones. There was tabby, there was coquina, and on the streets we find up to 7 layers. Some of the architecture that dealt with the climate of St. Augustine, which was harsh, humid, balconies, which were transitional spaces so people could get outside, away from the hot internal temperatures, and loges. And again, the Spanish town plan. This is 1855, and you can really recognize the old market, government house, the cathedral, then a parish church. And my wife Rosa Maria is here. She came and we first lived in Tallahassee, and she took a trip around Tallahassee. She goes, "Where is downtown?" It's not like a Spanish town. And you find the Spanish town in St. Augustine, of course, Puerto Rico, Cuba, throughout Spanish America. And everything has a place, and everything is in its place. This is another view. But you have the seat of government. And the government house, this building is from 1935, it's on the location of the original government's site. The parish church, later the Cathedral of St. Augustine. The Central Plaza was originally a Plaza of de Armas. It was a drill field, basically. But in 1813, it was renamed Plaza de la Constitución to commemorate the Spanish Constitution. And we have in the plaza really the only monument left that is associated with the Spanish Constitution. The colonial period ended with the transfer of Florida from Spain to the United States. And this is St. Augustine in the late 19th century, about the time the Historical Society was established. So it was old and it looked old because we'd had a period from the end of the Second Seminole War of economic depression, the Civil War, and the city was in deteriorated condition, often ruinous condition. So this is what people, and particularly the founders of the St. Augustine Historical Society, found: the Castillo, the town plan, and this very, very historic looking town, again with the Spanish architecture, the buildings set on directly on the street, the balconies, and the other features that I talked about. And the city was really a mosaic. This is some models of the O'Reilly House, and we've got similar models of the oldest house, and show how the city developed. The nearest is the O'Reilly House in the first Spanish period. The second is during the British period. And the last is when the building, and it's kind of mistaken, but it was actually done around 1870. But still with a lot of techniques from the territorial and even the second Spanish period, because the people that worked on these buildings were oftentimes the Menorcans who had come here during the British period, and many of them remained during the second Spanish period, and they were the carpenters, the masons, the artisans of the community. So in 1883, we have the founding of the society. And somebody I want to mention, Dr. DeWitt Webb, founder and director of the St. Augustine Historical Society during the period 1883 till his death in 1917. Really the heart and soul of the society during that period. He was a doctor from New York. He came to St. Augustine and, again, as I said, became the driving force of the society and really kept the society alive, particularly in the years before his death, and basically died destitute. He had given so much of his time and money to the maintenance of the society. So clearly, the Society is a pioneer preservation organization. It was founded in 1883, and the name was a little bit misleading. It was called then the St. Augustine Institute of Science, but it was always involved in history. Initially, members of the society gave lectures. They collected memorabilia and documents, memorabilia and document, and part of the leisure activities were giving tours to historic sites. 1912, the name was changed to include the name Historical Society, and you can see the society was in business for 52 years before the next preservation organization, the National Park Service, was established when it came in and took over the custodianship and the stewardship of the Castillo de San Marcos. For a brief period of time, we had the Carnegie Institution program, which when all was said and done, more was said than done. And then in 1959, the state of Florida established the St. Augustine Historic Preservation Board, it was later known. And it wasn't until 1974 that the city of St. Augustine became involved in historic preservation when the Historic Architectural Review Board was established. So the activities in historic preservation by the Historical Society were fairly typical. It was a time before government really got involved in historic preservation, and a similar and kind of model organization was the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which was established in 1859. It's hard for me to believe that Mount Vernon is not a federal property, but it's not, and it hasn't been since the Mount Vernon Ladies Association took it over in 1859. The ladies went to the federal government, they went to the state of Virginia, and there wasn't an interest in acquiring and preserving Mount Vernon. It said they did it themselves. And that's much the same as what the experience of the St. Augustine Historical Society. One of the early activities was identifying historic sites. One of the first in 1896 was the site of the Osceola capture. There's been some, I guess, Monday morning quarterbacking that it wasn't exactly where the supposed eyewitness said it was, but I think the intention was sincere, and I think this dates from the 1930s. The society actually went out, and this was one of the marker programs that they started. The Oglethorpe Battery was another, beginning in the early 20th century, identifying the site. And later, in the 1930s, the society acquired the site and erected the monument then, as it was known, the St. Augustine Historical Society and Institute of Science. One of the most important contributions of the society was in 1911, when the board wrote the Department of War and informed them of the deteriorating condition of Fort Matanzas, now again a National Historic Landmark. And fortunately, the Department of War listened to the society and took measures to stabilize the structure. And later, I believe in 1929, the society actually did physical preservation work on Fort Matanzas. The first actual control of a historic site or building was a leasing of the Vetter House. And you can see here, this occurred around the 1900, St. Augustine Institute of Science and Historical Society. And the society acquired what was known as the Vetter Collection, which was historic memorabilia, and also a lot of natural science items. Unfortunately, in 1914, there was a fire many of you know about that destroyed much of St. Augustine north of the plaza, and the Vetter House, and the Society's collection was destroyed at that time. But like a phoenix rising from the ashes, the Society that same year really entered its golden age of existence, beginning with its relationship with the Castillo de San Marco from 1914 to 1945. The Society had an agreement with the Department of War. It was allowed to give tours. It had a gift shop. It was involved in the daily maintenance and performed actual preservation work. And this relationship was done through Dr. Webb and particularly supported federally by Senator Duncan U. Fletcher, the senator from Florida. And in 1918, we have the acquisition of the oldest house. Here's the board of directors, really visionary men of guts who were responsible for acquiring the house. So I call it the golden age. Imagine that. The Society at one time controlled the Castillo and the oldest house, arguably the two most important historic tourist destinations in the city, and a source of revenue because tourists wanted to go and above all visit the Castillo, but certainly come and visit the Historical Society and the oldest house. And here we have boy, this is a great photograph, the board members on the way to purchase the oldest house. But which oldest house? I love this. This was an essay that was written, I believe in 1917 by Ring Lardner, the famous author. And Lardner came and says, first I went to St. George Street and visited the oldest house in the United States. Then we went to Hospital Street and seen the oldest house in the United States. Then we turned the corner and went down St. Francis Street and inspected the oldest house in the United States. Then we dropped into a soda fountain and I had an egg phosphate made from the oldest egg in the Western Hemisphere. We passed up lunch and got into a carriage drawn by the oldest horse in Florida, and we rode through the country all afternoon and the driver told us some of the oldest jokes in the book. But I say, Ring Lardner says 3, Dr. Parker said 7 in her presentation in early October. The Vetter House was one of the ones considered to be the oldest house, but of course it burned in 1914. But Ring Lardner was talking about the Paredes Dodge House on St. George Street, you see here. And it's interesting, we look at it now, and this is clearly a second Spanish period building because of the architecture. The dormers and the side gable. It's a building that's constructed in the English Tidewater vernacular tradition, but with certain features associated with St. Augustine, built directly on the street, and of course built of coquina. And then the other oldest house was Whitney's oldest house, also known as the Don Toledo house. And then finally, our oldest house, 14 St. Francis Street. And I love this. How many buildings have poems written about them? But the oldest house, the Gonzalez Alvarez house on St. Francis Street was one that did. And again, partly, I think contributing to the golden age of the Society at this time was the fact that the president of the Society was Senator Chauncey Depew of New York. Senator Depew was kind of a figurehead. The day-to-day activities were run by other people, but he was a very respected national figure. And again, I think he was very important in maintaining the relationship that the Society had with the Department of War and maintaining the stewardship of the Castillo de San Marcos during this period. So the Society got a lot of criticism early on because of its claims about the oldest house. And I like to say the Society began to move from history buffs to history professionals. It was during this time that Emily Wilson was hired as a librarian and historian. The Society really began to develop its collection during this period. Acquisition by Emily Wilson of the Roque map and also the Puente map, which are fundamental to understanding the history of historic preservation, historic buildings in the community. And then another major step in the professionalization of the society occurred in 1937 when the society hired Dr. Vern Chatelain. You can see first historian of the National Park Service, and he was really the preeminent authority on historic sites and buildings in the United States. And Dr. Chatelain really helped the society evaluate its collection, tried to make the interpretation of the oldest house more professional, and really was the one that conceptualized the restoration of the oldest house back to the colonial period, which occurred in the 1950s. And he was truly probably the first scholar writing about St. Augustine and historic sites. He published The Defenses of Spanish Florida, 1565 to 1763. And he was also the director of the Carnegie Program from 1936 to 1942. Another step in the professionalization of the society's program was archaeology, particularly led by by John Griffin, Dr. Hale Smith of Florida State. Dr. Griffin and Dr. Smith both did excavations at the oldest house, and through the evidence they found, they were able to establish a date of construction somewhere around 1700, likely, through the artifacts and their analysis of the building that they performed. So, along with the acquisition, the restoration of the Gonzalez Alvarez house was an important activity of the society in the 1950s. Another part of the professional approach to the preservation of the Gonzalez Alvarez house was forensic architecture, particularly the work of the Historical American Building Survey. And one of the things they did was analyze the various stages of the oldest house, from a first Spanish building, a British addition, and then later we see additions that date to the late 19th century. So it gave a factual basis for evaluating and determining how the oldest house is going to be restored. So what to do? This is the way the oldest house looked in 1918 when the society acquired it. It had dormers, these hoods over the entrances, the corner tower, all which were Flagler era, Victorian era additions. What to do with those? And the question is a good one. For example, the St. Francis Inn, another colonial building, it's kept the late 19th century additions to this day. I think it's more of a question today now than it was then. A lot of these additions were still fairly new in the 1950s, only about 40 or 50 years old. But today, the Secretary of the Interior Standards, one of the questions that they ask is, are later additions significant? So it was an interesting question. But the decision was made at that time to restore the oldest house, the Gonzalez Alvarez house, to the colonial period in 1959. There was forensic architecture. There were a lot of great old photographs. And then we see this photograph from the late 19th century. And here we see the Gonzalez Alvarez house, 1959. This is one of the Historic American Building Survey photographs, really restored to the way it looked in the colonial period after the first Spanish period house was built and a British addition was added to it. The society, after World War II, undertook a number of other important historic preservation projects. It assumed stewardship of the Lambias House. At that time, the Lambias House had been part of the Carnegie Institution program, and it was given to the city of St. Augustine. And I believe it was 1945, the city conveyed to the Historical Society under an agreement, the Lambias House. In the 1950s, there was a major restoration of the Lambias House undertaken. Let me go back. And also I wanted to mention there were a number of other historic restoration projects done at that time. The Trier House, the Fornell's house, the Paredes Dodge house that I mentioned, were all acquired by the Historical Society. They were restored and then they were resold to other entities with restrictive covenants. So it was really one of the original uses of what turned out to be a revolving fund in St. Augustine. And one of the big issues during the 1950s, nothing ever changes, traffic. And there was a move to expand the bayfront. Here we've got a historic view of the bayfront, much like the Battery in Charleston was the way it looked. And then this is what we got. The society very much publicly opposed this, and I think looking back, an opportunity was lost. But the good news is, I think people became very, very concerned about historic preservation in the city. In 1959, because of this, and also because of the upcoming 400-year celebration, the Historic Preservation Estate Program was formed. So some good things did come out of this. In 1970, the Gonzalez-Alvarez House and the Lambias House were recognized as National Historic Landmarks. 2 of the 4 that were recognized at that particular time, along with the town plan and the Cathedral of St. Augustine. 1964, the Historical Society Library was built, and this was so important to me, and particularly the work that we did in 1978 to 80 on the Historic Building Survey. David Nolan and I really cut our teeth here with help of Jackie Beersley and other librarians at that particular time. So this is a very important historic preservation education, and a place where people could go and do research on historic sites and historic preservation. And of course, 1989, another important building came under the stewardship of the Society, the C. Kirby Smith, the former public library. And this is a center of the Society's research, and again, a place to go to do research on historic buildings and historic preservation. So today, I think it's fair to say the Society is really one of the most important local preservation organizations in the country. The Museum Bookstore, Tovar House, St. Francis Park, all under the stewardship of the Historical Society. And the Society continues to be very actively involved in historic preservation activities. I think one of the really neat things the Society has done is the Herschel Shepard Award for Historic Preservation. And of course, here's Herschel Shepard. He's a preeminent historic preservation architect in the state, along with the first recipient of the Herschel Shepard Award, Kathy Deegan, who's made such great contributions to St. Augustine and really a lot of other places in historic archaeology, and they both worked for many, many years, decades, on the oldest house complex and particularly the Gonzalez-Alvarez house. And recently, the Society gave the Shepard Award to Accord, which is a local grassroots organization involved in the preservation of and recognition of sites and buildings associated with the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So the Society is not just involved in colonial or long ago history, but more recent history. And I think this was a very, very important recognition because this activity had national significance and really led to the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So important recognition and through the Herschel Shepard Historic Preservation Award. And finally, the Society has participated in the development and implementation this year of the City of St. Augustine's Historic Preservation Master Plan. I worked on that, and Margot back in September gave a very good presentation to the Historic Architectural Review Board. And this is a critical document moving forward. Right now, I think we're in one of the most important periods in the preservation of St. Augustine with a concern over natural disasters and hurricanes and flooding. And hopefully the master plan is going to address some of those issues. And of course the society has the oldest house, the Lombius house, Tovar house, all that were impacted by the hurricane. So it's important for us to take measures and work with the city to preserve those historic resources. So there it is, St. Augustine Historical Society, Historic Conscious of St. Augustine. Thanks very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.